Time to play the game. Time to play the game.
Hello everyone, Mr. Moomaw here. Welcome back to Mr. Moomaw's Lectures. Good to have seen you guys again at OCA, especially Miss McCall and Miss Hahn. Glad every time I can come down there. I look forward to coming down again as soon as possible. Today I thought I'd talk about, like I said, kind of on schedule to talk about, the American Revolution, the Revolutionary War. This is what everything we've been talking about so far has led up to. We talked about the Americas before the Europeans showed up. We talked about the establishment of the European colonies, British colonies in North America. We talked about the French and Indian War and First Great Awakening, when all these trends come together in terms of developing a distinct identity from the British. And then we talked about the lead up to the Revolution, where there's this period of about 10 to 13 years where there's just this disintegration in the relationship between the colonies and the mother country. Well, it's come to a head, and this is that. This is the Revolutionary War. Lexington and Concord, those battles are done. Thomas Gage has sent back word there's an armed insurrection, and we need help, and thus, here you come. Now, I mentioned when we talked about Prelude to the Revolution, or actually no, when I talked about the French and Indian War, I mentioned some of the military tactics and weapons they're using, and it'll help you to have in your head this image of what these battles actually look like, to understand what's going on. We talked about this musket, this smoothbore long arm you put on your shoulder. We talked about the significance of smoothbore, how everybody had to get into a line in order to just send a wall of lead downfield because otherwise it's really hard to hit something. We talked about the line formation as a way to block cavalry, the use of the bayonet, that big spike you put on the end of your gun to fight off enemy horsemen, things like that. So we should be clear at this point about the way these guys are set up, just in terms of that. To begin with, and I know it's kind of blurry, I think part of the problem is I'm using white backgrounds. I've kind of looked at the old situation with the glare and everything. I think if I do a black background with white text, it works better. So that's what I'm going to do in the future. For now, though, just kind of bear with me what I'm saying. And remember, all these slides are going to be at the end of this video as usual, so don't worry about that. So, Patriots or Americans, Patriots, I'll use the term Americans and Patriots interchangeably. It's just sort of the Patriot Army, Continental Army. The Continental Army, the Americans, they have surrounded Boston. They essentially have Boston under siege, which is to say they've surrounded it, making it so the British Army can't get out. Now, the British Navy can... Last change. The British... Sorry. We have bells here. The British Navy is always going to be more powerful than the American Navy throughout the war. And they're able to take their ships and just come and go as they please throughout the war. So while they have Boston cut off by land, the British are able to get in and out by boat. Now, of course, being surrounded, though, is still a problem for them. The British are worried that the colonists are going to be able to cut them off somehow from the sea. They're worried that more and more of these guys are showing up every day. It's not just a militia now, but this actual full Continental Army. So one thing they want to do is just keep the pressure on these guys. The colonists try to set up a fortified position at a place called Breed's Hill. That was called Bunker Hill, but understand it's actually found a place called Breed's Hill. The colonists attempt to set up a fortified position there, and when they do so, the British launch an attack out of Boston against them. And this is a good example of how this war is going to go, at least in its initial stages. The British, they form up in their lines, and they march up the hill. And as they're marching up the hill, the soldiers at the top form up, and they fire down on the British. And their fire is pretty effective. The British really underestimate how willing these Americans are to fight. They think they're going to chase them off the field each time. Mainly because they do chase them off the field each time, but they do take a lot of casualties in the meantime. British charge up the hill against the American position, get shot to pieces, come back, march back up, get shot all up, march back, march up again, and this time they go up, bayonets fixed, and they chase the Americans off the top of the hill. Remember, guys, when you're in a line formation like this, when you're in any kind of war situation, all you're doing is looking at the guy to the left and to the right, and you're asking yourself, are those guys going to stay where they are? Because everybody knows you're not supposed to run, but everybody also knows you don't want to be the last one to do it. So when you see this line of British soldiers marching towards you, they're marching in formation, the officer gives the word, present, they drop their muskets down with their bayonets, huzzah, like this, and they get ready. Well, that's when you start weighing your options, and you start running away, which is what these guys do. Nonetheless, while the British won this battle, they got rid of the guys off that hill. It is a Pyrrhic victory, which is to say they lost so many men that it wasn't even worth winning. This is going to be something you see a lot of times, where the British, they'll win, they'll chase the Americans off the field, but they're losing men, and not just human lives, they're losing money, they're losing time. Wars are expensive, I can't stress that enough. Now, coming to take command of the Continental Army is someone we've already met, General George Washington. Continental Army gives Washington the job mainly because Washington is just the main guy out there. In terms of the French and Indian War, he's the guy who comes out with the best reputation. He's certainly America's most well-known military officer. And the Continental Congress gives him the commission, and he goes out. Now, when he goes out to command these soldiers, what does he find in Boston? Well, the Continental Army is in bad shape. There's almost no discipline. They're mixed in with the militia. The militia come and go as they please. Get a bunch of young men together in one place. 90% boredom, 10% terror, war. These guys, they have way too much free time. They're going, getting drunk. They're harassing people. They're going after the ladies that follow the armies around as their job, and lack of a better word. And so the soldiers are doing all that, and well, the side effect of that is you get diseases, venereal disease, which sounds funny or whatever, but that puts you out of action. It's as silly as it is. That's a major cause of problems, readiness problems that Washington has. So Washington has to whip this drunken rabble into shape, which he's not successful at doing at first. It takes him a few years before he really gets going. In the meantime, the men's lack of discipline and their propensity to run away is a major problem for him. Now, Washington does have one initial success. He manages to chase the British out of Boston. He's able to do this because the Patriot Army, way up here in upstate New York, where we're not talking about because it's only an hour long, upstate New York, they've fought this battle called Ticonderoga. They've taken all these cannons from a British fort. They drag all these cannons all the way down to Boston. And then they put them in place around the city such that the British Army has to evacuate or it's going to be destroyed. So they evacuate, and Washington is completely powerless to stop this. Again, the British have a better navy. And if you know your geography, you know where these guys are going next. Next, they're going to... Where are they going? Geography. Where's next? Boston up here. Very important city. Where are they going next? Of course, they're going to New York. The British have a new commander. They've gotten rid of Gage, and they put in his place a guy named Howe, William Howe. Howe has a brother named Richard Howe, who's an admiral. General's a very political job. We'll talk about that as we move it along, too. Well, Howe leaves Boston, and he heads over to New York, which is the next biggest city, and so great place to attack. Or next big city, I should say. Now, Washington marches the army over to meet him, and Washington loses over and over and over again. This Battle of Long Island is the collective term for a whole series of battles that are fought in New York through August or October of 1776. Now, Washington loses these battles. And Howe, this is the weird thing, this is the thing historians still debate, Howe has the ability to surround Washington's army and never does. Howe has the ability to drop the hammer on Washington's army and never does. Why? Maybe he was just a timid general. Maybe he hoped that if he just beat Washington bad enough, Washington would just give up rather than keep fighting. But that didn't happen. So even though Howe has chance after chance to shut Washington down, he doesn't take it. Washington's even mystified by this. Also, another thing that's happened in the interim. We're talking here about August and October of 1776. But what happened in the month before that? What happened in July? July of 1776? I know you can't answer me. I'm just asking you anyway. Declaration of Independence. Yes. You knew it. Good job. Wherever you are. Declaration of Independence. The Continental Congress finally decides negotiations with Britain are pointless. We're going to declare independence. We're going to be an independent country. They farmed the job out to Thomas Jefferson, one of America's great prose stylists, along with unwanted editorial tips from Benjamin Franklin and John Adams. Thomas Jefferson, who we'll be talking about a lot later on. Don't think I'm skipping him. Thomas Jefferson writes this document, basically an explanation of why we're seeking independence, our rational grounds for doing so, and then a list of specific grievances the United States has that justifies it. Please understand, the men who put their names on this Declaration of Independence, they signed their death warrant. conceivably, these guys could have been, well, they would have been executed as traitors anyway. Conceivably, they could have been, you see the end of Braveheart, hung, drawn, and quartered, dragged to your place of execution. They hang you just enough to where you realize you're being hung. Then they pull you down, they cut off your male anatomy and burn it in front of your face. They cut open your abdomen, rip out your intestines. And then they kill you. Then they cut your head off. Dip your head in tar, put it on London Bridge so everybody can see it. They confiscate all your property, and your name is just cursed forever. So that's why when they said, our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor, that's literally what they meant. These guys put their lives on the line for this. So Washington gets beat in New York. That's great. Not so great for Washington. Washington gets beat in New York, and he retreats to Philadelphia because he knows, again, geography, Boston, New York, Philadelphia. That's where they're going next. Now, Washington has just been all kinds of beat. Other than that siege of Boston, he has just been chased all over the place, just endlessly. So his men, their morale is very, very low. Now, morale is a very important characteristic of an army. It's not something measurable, but it's the confidence, really, that people have in themselves, their men, and their cause. The idea that what are the odds of us winning? Does their general care about us? There's spiritedness, in other words. Washington's army has very low morale. Washington knows he has to increase that. He needs some kind of victory, he needs something. And interestingly, the opportunity presents itself on Christmas Day, 1776. Washington, his famous crossing of the Delaware, Washington finds out that there is a squad of Hessian soldiers stationed in Trenton, New Jersey, across the Delaware River from his position. Now, these Hessians are Germans. They're mercenaries from a place called Hesse. The British government essentially has hired these mercenaries, hired soldiers to come over and fight in the Americas for them. Or fight in America for them. Americas, we're way past that. America for them. So these guys, they're there because they're being paid. They're not really that into the cause. And they're spending Christmas Day the way people typically spent Christmas Day back then, especially if you're a young man, getting blotto drunk and passing out. Now, that's not really typically a big problem because usually nobody campaigns in the middle of winter. Everybody goes home, they sit in their tents until spring, then they go out and fight again. Washington, though, has a bold tactic. Washington loads his army into boats along the Delaware River, and in the middle of the night, they row their way across this icy, frozen river in the pitch black dark. The picture you're going to see is Washington standing in his boat very famously, kind of like Captain Morgan, looking off in the distance, nobly, that kind of thing. In real life, of course, you can see all this. In real life, it's pitch black. The river's freezing cold in December in Pennsylvania, New Jersey. So bad time. Anything could have gone wrong. Boats could have gotten separated. Your boat lands. You don't know if everybody else's boat's landed. So you have all those problems. Nonetheless, Washington manages to hit the other side of the Delaware River. His army converges around Trenton, and they surprise the sleeping Hessians. After a few casualties in a really desultory battle, they defeat them and capture all of them. So Washington won a major victory at Trenton. However, British come marching toward Philadelphia. Washington marches back over to fight them off, and unfortunately for Washington, he is soundly beaten at the Battle of the Brandywine, and the British capture Philadelphia. So the British now have New York and Philadelphia, two of America's leading cities, and things are not going well for Washington. And what's worse for Washington, not only are things going bad for him, they're going well for his rivals. General, like I said, is a very political job, which means that Washington's the head general. There's all these other generals, though, and they all want Washington's job. They all want to replace him. So they're all out there looking for glory and trying to get the political connections they need to do so. One of these guys is a guy named Horatio Gates. Horatio Gates is Washington's biggest rival, thinks he should have been put in charge from the beginning. Gates, and actually has some success too. So a lot of people are saying, well, maybe we should replace Washington with Gates. Gates' biggest advantage, though, is that he has a very talented subordinate, a guy working for him, another general named Benedict Arnold. Benedict Arnold, at this point, is one of America's leading heroes. He tried to invade Canada, didn't really work. Fought the Battle of Ticonderoga. He's wounded in battle. So, again, this guy's reputation is really sterling. Benedict Arnold is everything Gates isn't. Gates is timid. Arnold is aggressive. Gates tends to be cautious. Benedict Arnold is very just aggressive, presses the action. Arnold is fanatically courageous. He charges into battle, fights. Gates is kind of suspicious of him. He's jealous of anybody who's more talented than he is. Nonetheless, though, he keeps Arnold around because Arnold is that important. Well, on the British side, war's gone on too long as far as everybody's concerned. Yeah, we have New York, we have Philadelphia, but we're not crushing these guys yet. Remember, Washington is winning as long as he has an army in the field. As long as there's a Continental Army, there's a revolution. As long as there's a revolution, the British have to keep sending over soldiers. As long as they keep having to do that, the war's going to keep grinding on. So the British government is very amenable to people who come to them with suggestions. One of those guys is a general named John Burgoyne. John Burgoyne, pretty flamboyant guy. Not only is he a general, he's also a playwright. He travels with a large collection of fancy dishware, actresses, and champagne. But he's also a pretty talented strategist. And Burgoyne goes to the British government and says, we're up here in Canada. We got, Howe over here in New York. What if we converge? We can move down the Hudson River, and he goes up the Hudson River. We come together. This will cut New York in half. New England's over here. We can isolate that. That's where the problem started. And then we'll deal with everybody else later. That's not a bad plan. The problem with it is that Burgoyne and William Howe don't really get along very well. So because they don't get along, they don't really coordinate as carefully as they should have. And while Burgoyne's marching south from Canada, Howe isn't moving to join him. In other words, I don't really think he was quite clear they needed him to march north at the same time. So Burgoyne marches down. He thinks he's got a lot more assistance than he does. So when Gates shows up and Arnold show up, Burgoyne is not prepared for them. Burgoyne and Gates and Arnold fight a running series of battles collectively known as the Battle of Saratoga throughout October of 1777. And Burgoyne is defeated. Burgoyne's army is surrounded. He's cut off. Howe's nowhere to be found.
All peer tutors and tutorees, all people that need to be tutored and sign up for tutoring, and the peer tutors need to be in the Rivers classroom at the correct time. Thank you.
All right, if you're a peer tutor, go to Miss Rivers' class. Good. All right. Burgoyne gets surrounded, and he has to surrender to Gates. This is huge. A British army has surrendered to an American army for the first time in the war. Now, I should say Gates had very little to do with this. All the impetus for battle came from Benedict Arnold. Does Benedict Arnold get any credit from Gates? No. Gates is jealous of his subordinate. He doesn't give him any credit in the dispatches. Benedict Arnold's very angry about this. And so when Benedict Arnold's loyalist wife says, hey, maybe you should switch sides and join the British, he listens to her. To make a very long story short, Benedict Arnold betrays the American army. He goes to the British, and his name is now a byword for traitor. Mostly because Gates just didn't treat him right. One of the major outcomes of the Battle of Saratoga is that it results in an alliance with the French government. Benjamin Franklin and John Adams, here's Ben Franklin. Benjamin Franklin and John Adams have been in France for a long time now, trying to get the French government to come into this war on the side of the Americans. The French are hesitant. They need some kind of sign that this country can survive on its own. Battle of Saratoga is just the signal they're looking for. Ben Franklin is able to convince the French government to come into the war on America's side. This French alliance is going to bear a lot of fruit later on. Not only because the French send a bunch of regular soldiers, but they also send their navy, which is also a key thing in stopping the British from getting from place to place so easily. For their part, the British unleash their Indian allies. The British government knows that the Indians are going to be much more eager to ally with them than the Americans. The British government has set up that proclamation line. The Americans, their Indians know, are going to get rid of that if they become an independent country. As the Americans get rid of the proclamation line, they're going to pour across the Appalachian Mountains. They are going to settle everywhere. They're going to push the Indians out. So it's in the Indians' interest to ally with the British. And the Indian warfare is typical. The British give them guns, give them financial support and all that stuff, and then they just go across the border and start burning down isolated settlements and stuff like that. Washington sends men against the Indians, the Six Nations, the mighty Six Nations of the Iroquois. Destroys towns. The Iroquois give Washington a name, means something like town destroyer or sacker of towns, because he just burns down their towns and lets them starve in the wilderness. So the American Revolution, and I don't touch on it enough because again it's pretty short, just one class lecture here, but the American Revolution is a frontier war in addition to everything else. The war is being fought not just in Philadelphia and New York, but all the way on the edge of as far as the American settlement's gone. And it's just as nasty as it is everywhere else. So, winter of 1777 going into 1778, Washington is at just a low point. His army's morale is just cratered. He's taken up winter quarters at a place called Valley Forge in Pennsylvania. It's the coldest winter on record. His men don't have anything like the needed supplies that they require to keep going. They're short of food, short of cloth, everything. What's worse is the local farmers are, remember Philadelphia, the Pennsylvania area is a lot of Quakers, they're pacifists, they don't care about the war one way or another. They love that the British are in Philadelphia with tons of British government money buying up food and stuff, so they sell all their stuff to the British. So Washington's men have to watch all these wagon loads of food and everything go by them every day going to Philadelphia to feed their enemies. So Washington, things are just looking really bad. What saves Washington is not only his own spirit, his own dogged determination to persevere, but also the fact that he's got really talented subordinates. 3 men in particular are going to be very important here. One, the first, Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton is very different than the other founding fathers. In the first place, he's not from America. He's born actually in the Caribbean, a little island called Nevis. He grows up in one of these little sugar islands, a lot of slaves, few plantation owners, dominate everybody. It's a fearful, violent place. Alone among all the founding fathers, Alexander Hamilton is the only one who's 100% throughout his life absolutely against slavery. His mother did not marry his father, which back then carried an enormous social stigma. And nowadays we have nice words like, single mother, non-traditional family. Back then they had whore and bastard, and that's what people call him, bastard. His father ran out on the family, such as it was. His mother dies when he's 11 years old, so he's basically just kind of alone in the world. He gets adopted by a merchant, and the guy puts him to work as a shipping clerk, basically. In his off hours, though, Alexander Hamilton studies. Alexander Hamilton is a man with an incredibly aggressive intellect. He's a genius. But unlike Jefferson, who's just kind of who's broadly interested in all kinds of things, Alexander Hamilton just attacks knowledge. Alexander Hamilton works all day and just reads all night. It's nothing for him to work 20 hours straight and read the whole time. He studies everything, not just classical history, but political science, books on agriculture, books on economics, books on mechanical, everything. Anything he can get his hands on, he studies. One day, he writes a poem in Nevis that gets put in the local newspaper, and a couple of rich doctors read it, and they say, wow, nice poem. Why don't we pay for this kid to go to school? Send him to America, New York, he'll go to school, and then we'll bring him back here and be a doctor on our island. So they send Alexander Hamilton to New York to go to school. He goes to a place called King's College, which is today Columbia University. And while he's there, the Revolutionary War breaks out. Wars upset existing social structures. People who are on top when a war starts, a lot of times that whole hierarchy falls apart. As the war drags on, there are more and more opportunities for people at the bottom with talents. People rise in a war and people fall in the war. And Alexander Hamilton is one of those guys who rises. He starts off at the bottom in every way. By the end of the war, he's extremely important. When the war starts, he joins the Patriot cause, starts his own little artillery company. Washington finds out about him. Once he really gets to know Washington, Washington puts him right on his general staff, essentially. He's a staff officer. And he handles all of Washington's organization and correspondence. This is a guy who's in his early 20s. And he is so trusted by Washington, he's allowed to write orders in Washington's name. In other words, he can write an order and sign it, George Washington, and send it off with Washington's full approval, without even Washington having to look at what he wrote. And we'll talk a lot more about him as we roll along. Next most important after him is a guy named Marquis de Lafayette. Marquis de Lafayette is a French aristocrat who is nonetheless a believer in the ideals of liberty as espoused by the American Revolution. So he comes from France to America to fight. In addition to being a well-connected aristocrat, he's also a talented officer. And when the French army finally shows up, Washington uses Lafayette as a liaison between him and Washington doesn't speak French. Uses him as a liaison between Washington himself and the French army in order to facilitate things. The third guy, and I shouldn't say the next one, they're all important. The third guy is this gentleman here, Baron von Steuben. Baron von Steuben shows up at Valley Forge claiming to be having been a general in the Prussian army, Prussia being a country in Europe, part of Germany and Poland today. Back then it was a country with the most powerful army in Europe, and Prussian officers were greatly respected. So he shows up and says he's this big Prussian officer, and so Washington says, great, you can train my men. Now, von Steuben kind of fudged things a little bit. He wasn't a high-ranking officer, and he wasn't an aristocrat, hence the bond. Nonetheless, he was an intimidating German guy. So Washington put him with Hamilton and Lafayette, and the three of them together whipped the Continental Army into shape. One good thing about Valley Forge, in terms of just morale, is that all the guys who were likely to leave left. All the guys who weren't 100% committed to the cause dipped out and went home. The people who remain are the hardcore, the people who really believe in this cause. And von Steuben is able to capitalize on that. First, he trains a company of guys in his Prussian methods, then more, until finally the army is just spending all its time toward the end of the winter drilling and drilling and drilling, until finally they emerge from this crucible, this frozen, starving nightmare of Valley Forge, a hardened, disciplined, organized army for the first time. And Washington is not slow to use them. When Washington marches out of Valley Forge in the spring, his army is a new thing. It is a new entity. Gone is all the weakness. Gone is all the propensity to run away. And when he hears that Howe is marching into New Jersey, Washington follows him. He's not running anymore. Washington tracks Howe down, and they fight a huge battle at a place called Monmouth, the Battle of Monmouth in New Jersey. It's fought in July. It's extremely hot. It's one of the hottest days of the year. They went from being freezing cold to incredibly hot. Men die of heat stroke all over the place. And Washington's men don't run. They stand with the British Army, and they fight the British Army, and the British Army is the one that has to leave the field. And now, the British government pretty much gives up on winning the war in the north, and they adopt a new strategy, a southern strategy. It was like Plan D. Plan D being, well, let's try the southern colonies. Most of those colonies were founded way later than the ones in the north. We start down in Georgia. Maybe we can rally loyalist support. We'll get people to join up with us down there, recruit local loyalist militias, and then we take control down there and then gradually work our way back up and pacify the situation. By now, and we're talking about 1778, essentially 1779, by now we're talking about, it really should have been obvious to the British at this point that this was not going to be a situation they could win. Wherever they send their army, it just makes things worse. There is no real, all the energy is in the movement for independence. There are loyalists. John Adams' own estimate, remember, is about a third of the people of the Americas are loyal to the British, and another third of the people in the American colonies just don't care. So only about a third of the colonists are actively supporting independence, but that's where all the energy is. And when the British come in with their army, when they raise loyalist militias, when they do all these things, it alienates a large segment of the population. And just for that and other reasons, this is why the revolution, even in its darkest hour, just always looks like the winning thing. And the British, it takes them a while to realize this, and by the time they've realized it, they've wasted a lot of money and lives. But before that happens, they go south. It must have looked to the British at first like this was a good strategy. They take over Savannah and Charleston. General Charles Cornwallis, they've again replaced commanders. They've gotten rid of Howe, and they brought in another guy named Henry Clinton. Clinton sends Charles Cornwallis south. Charles Cornwallis takes over Savannah, and he takes over Charleston. So great, he's got the cities, just like the British still have Philadelphia, they still have New York, they've got these cities up north. Now it's time to control the interior. In order to move in order to raise loyalist militias like the plan called for, Cornwallis sends one of his top subordinates, a guy named Banastre Tarleton, into the interior. Banastre Tarleton is a cavalry commander, hence the nice green coat and feathery hat right there. He's a cavalry commander. He's in charge of something called the British Legion, which is a mixed unit of loyalist militia and British regular cavalry. Tarleton, in turn, sends another guy, a guy named Major Patrick Ferguson, further into the interior, to the mountain regions, in order to raise militia and subdue things there. Now, Patrick Ferguson is the first guy to have problems. He makes his way out to the mountain region, basically, and just starts threatening everybody. He says, if I have to come through here, if you guys don't swear allegiance to the king and I got to come through here, I'm going to destroy this area with fire and the sword. Well, the local rednecks who lived out in the mountains up there, they just took a lot of offense to this. So Ferguson gets together his loyalists and everything like that, but not enough. There's a coalition of colonial militia, a coalition of American patriot militia, led by, among other people, Isaac Shelby, John Sevier, a bunch of people who become famous later on in Tennessee. These guys lead a coalition of militia groups against Ferguson, and they have Ferguson basically pinned down at the top of a place called Kings Mountain. Kings Mountain's not really a mountain, it's really like a big hill. Now, the British think they're good. They realize that the colonists, as long as they stay up on top of the hill with their bayonets, they're going to be able to charge up the hill and beat them. Problem is, that's not really the Patriot strategy here. These frontiersmen with their rifles basically just stay at the foot of the hill and just pick these British soldiers off until the British soldiers have to charge them, and they spread apart and they regroup again. It's a complete fiasco. Ferguson's men are just killed all over the place. Ferguson himself takes about 8 rifle rounds to the chest. He's dead. So the Battle of Kings Mountain is a major bust for the British. Further in the interior, Tarleton and his Tory Legion, along with a bunch of other regulars, fight who else but Horatio Gates, the big hero of Saratoga. He marches down with his army and engages the British at a battle called Camden. Camden, unfortunately, is a major Patriot loss, and Horatio Gates is last seen fleeing from the battlefield as fast as he can on his horse. And that's it for Horatio Gates and his military career. In order to face Tarleton, Washington sends Nathaniel Greene, a general who's actually, oddly enough, a Quaker. Came from a pacifist family, besides, nuts to that. He's known as a fighting Quaker. Nathaniel Greene comes down south, and Greene sends his top guy, a guy named Daniel Morgan, to deal with Tarleton. Tarleton and Morgan come together at a place called Cowpens. By the way, if you live in South Carolina, if you haven't been to these battlefield sites, you really ought to go. I've been to both Kings Mountain and Cowpens and Camden, and they're all 3 of them, and they're all really interesting places. Now, Tarleton believes, with some justification, that American militia will just run away. When he rides in with his men, these guys will be chased off. Tarleton, in fact, has something of a reputation as a butcher of fleeing militia. We mentioned earlier, technically, all of these subjects of the crown are in revolt against the king, and thus are subject to arrest and execution. Technically, all these people are rebels, and technically they're just basically the equivalent of bandits or thieves as far as the army is concerned. In practice, the British Army tends not to treat these guys like prisoners of war. Mainly because they're just going to have to come in and rule these people one day. They don't want to alienate them too much. Tarleton, though, is of the opinion these people are traitors and they should be treated harshly. His men kill wounded prisoners, they massacre people who are trying to surrender, that kind of thing. Tarleton's a nasty guy. So Tarleton's convinced that the Patriots will run away. The militia will run away like they always do. So he sees Morgan there, he set up a line of militia in the front. Tarleton says, no problem, he charges right in. The militia fires a few volleys, and the militia run away. And Tarleton charges in right into a line of regular Continental Army soldiers. As soon as they see Tarleton, they open fire. And Tarleton's men are kind of in disarray. They're charging on their horses. They don't understand why these guys are standing and shooting at them, not running away like the militia did. At the same time, American cavalry sweeps in around them. Cavalry commanded by a guy named William Washington, one of George Washington's cousins. William Washington sees Tarleton off in the distance and rides over with his saber. Where now is the braggart Tarleton? And the two engage in a furious saber duel. Tarleton, one of his men shoots Washington's horse out from under him. Tarleton bears down on Washington. One of Washington's soldiers, black soldier, comes up and there were a lot of black soldiers in the Revolutionary War, something overlooked, but very important. As a matter of fact, we'll talk about that as we move into the early Republic later on. We talk about slavery later on, the fact that do not think that black Americans, Americans of African descent are strictly speaking slaves. There are always large, free black communities. Many of these take part in the Revolutionary War. A little aside. Well, one of William Washington's soldiers, black soldier, stabs the guy who's coming to kill Washington. Tarleton bears down on Washington, and Tarleton fight, and then Tarleton flees from the field in disarray. His Tory Legion is defeated. Cowpens, or Kings Mountain and Cowpens, are major defeats for the British. They basically mean the British are completely unable to control the backcountry and the mountain region. Patriot militias will be free to operate there. It's a nasty situation out there, please understand. People on the frontier, some side with the British, some side with the Patriots, and they fight each other. There's all kinds of personal feuds. They get sucked into this. It's a nasty war. Andrew Jackson, who we're going to talk about later, is right smack in the middle of all this nastiness. So, finally, Cornwallis and Greene himself come together at a battle called Guilford Courthouse. Technically, the British win this battle. However, Guilford Courthouse is another one of those Pyrrhic victories. British lose so many men. At this point, the Southern strategy is just pointless. The French are coming into the war. They haven't raised all these loyalist militias to the degree they thought they would. There isn't that vast loyalist sentiment they had hoped for. So Cornwallis at this point basically marches back up to Virginia to await orders and to link up with Henry Clinton. And he takes up shop at a place called Yorktown Peninsula. Now, normally this would be a good position. Sure, he's on a peninsula, he's kind of cut off from the rest of the mainland, but if things really get bad, the British Navy can just come, pick up all his men, transport them wherever, where else they want to go. This would have been a great strategy in 1777, 1778, even maybe as late as 1779. By 1781, that's not going to work, because now the French Navy is in the picture. The French Navy defeats the British Navy in a battle off the coast, and the French Navy are thus able to blockade the peninsula. Washington shows up with his Continental Army blocking the landward side. So you got the French blocking the ocean, Washington blocking the landward, and Cornwallis is trapped. The Battle of Yorktown, sometimes you'll see the Siege of Yorktown, I forget what I gave you a term, but both of them work. For about a month, the British Army is pinned down to Yorktown. Washington attacks and attacks. They try to get out, and they can't. Finally, October 19, 1781, Cornwallis realizes he has to surrender. And so, he walks over, or he sends his men over with his sword. The guy tries to give the sword to the French general, not Washington, as an insult. The French general declines the sword. Washington refuses to accept the sword. He has one of his subordinate officers accept the sword, insulting the British in return. The British stack their arms and march off. Now, this is 1781. The war is not technically over until 1783, and a lot of stuff could have gone wrong after Yorktown. But after Yorktown, there's really no hope of the British winning a victory, or at least having the situation remain what it had been before the Revolutionary War broke out. 1783, the British government and the newly recognized government of the United States sign a treaty, another Treaty of Paris, 1783, ending the Revolutionary War, and the United States of America is now an independent country. So went the Revolutionary War. All right, well, guys, if you have any questions, let Ms. Hahn or Ms. McCall know, or email me, jmumla@gracia.com. I don't know if I ever passed that along to you, actually. I should have. If you ever want to email me directly, by all means, do. I love hearing from you guys, and I'll be able to see you guys soon again, hopefully. I look forward to being able to come down there again. So really looking forward to that. I had a great time last time, I think I mentioned, and I'll have a great time next time, I'm sure. So until next time, Oceanside Academy, I'll see you guys later. Ms. Hahn, Ms. McCall, see you guys later. And thank you for watching.
Time to play the game. Time to play the game.